Have you ever wondered if your last name carries a secret that has survived for more than 400 years? What if your family name could be traced back to one of the most famous voyages in history? Not through myths, not through family legends, but through real historical records. In 1620, just 102 passengers boarded a small wooden ship called the Mayflower and sailed across the Atlantic in search of a better future. They faced violent storms, freezing temperatures, starvation, and disease. By the end of their very first winter in America, almost half of them were dead. Most people think that's where the story ends. It doesn't. Today, historians estimate that more than 35 million Americans descend from those few survivors. That's an astonishing number from a single ship carrying just over 100 people. So here's the question. Could your last name be one of theirs? Stay until the end, because one of the names on this list belongs to a man who wasn't even a pilgrim, while another belongs to someone who survived certain death by holding onto a single rope in the fatter middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Their decisions changed history forever. Before we begin, subscribe to Unknown Discoveries and turn on notifications. If you're fascinated by hidden history, genealogy, and the forgotten people who shaped our world, you're in the right place. When the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, on September 6, 1620, the passengers believed they were sailing to Virginia. Instead, fierce Atlantic storms pushed them hundreds of miles off course until they reached Cape Cod. They were exhausted, frightened, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. Before leaving the ship, they signed what became known as the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to work together for the survival of the colony. It was a simple agreement, but one that would influence the development of self-government in America. Among those passengers was a man whose writings would preserve this entire story: William Bradford. Bradford's life was shaped by hardship long before he stepped aboard the Mayflower. Orphaned as a child, he found comfort in a group of religious reformers who believed they should worship freely rather than follow the Church of England. That belief forced him into exile in the Netherlands, where he spent years dreaming of building a new community in the New World. At the age of 30, Bradford finally boarded the Mayflower with his wife Dorothy, believing they were beginning a new chapter together. Instead, tragedy struck almost immediately. Only days after reaching Cape Cod Harbor, Dorothy fell overboard and drowned before she ever stepped onto American soil. Only days after reaching Cape Cod Harbor, Dorothy fell overboard and drowned before she ever stepped onto American soil. Bradford had crossed an ocean for a better future, only to lose the person he loved most before that future even began. Many people would have returned home. Bradford stayed. Many people would have returned home. Bradford stayed. Over the next 3 decades, he became the colony's governor and carefully recorded its struggles, triumphs, and daily life in his journal of Plymouth Plantation. Without his detailed account, much of what we know about the Mayflower today would have disappeared forever. His descendants include actor Clint Eastwood, publishing entrepreneur Hugh Hefner, and Noah Webster, whose dictionary helped shape American English. One orphan from rural England became the ancestor of millions. But as extraordinary as Bradford's story is, the next passenger's survival is almost impossible to believe. John Howland was only 21 years old when the Mayflower encountered one of its worst storms. Ignoring orders to remain below deck, he climbed onto the ship's exposed deck just as a massive wave struck. In an instant, he was swept overboard into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. A fall like that almost always meant death. The ship couldn't simply stop. The waves were enormous. The water was icy. Yet somehow, Howland managed to grab a rope trailing behind the ship. As waves crashed over him, he refused to let go. Crew members finally spotted him and pulled him back aboard just before he disappeared beneath the sea. That single moment changed history. Had John Howland let go of that rope, millions of people alive today would never have existed. After surviving the crossing, he married Elizabeth Tilley, another passenger who had been orphaned during the colony's first winter. Together, they raised 10 children, creating one of the largest Mayflower family lines. Among their descendants are actor Christopher Lloyd, Humphrey Bogart, philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, and countless others. It's incredible to think that one desperate grip on a rope helped shape generations of American history. And believe it or not, the next surname belongs to a man who never intended to become a colonist at all. He boarded the Mayflower for one simple job, but a single decision transformed him into one of the most influential ancestors in America. We'll uncover that story next. The man who almost drowned wasn't the only passenger whose future changed because of a single decision. The next surname belongs to someone who never intended to settle in America at all. John Alden wasn't a pilgrim. He wasn't escaping religious persecution, and he wasn't searching for a new beginning. He was a cooper, a skilled craftsman hired to repair the wooden barrels that carried the Mayflower's food, water, and supplies. His contract was simple: help the ship complete its journey, then return to England. But history rarely follows the plan. When the Mayflower reached Cape Cod, the struggling settlers realized they desperately needed skilled workers. They asked Alden to remain with them. He could have returned home to safety, but instead he chose uncertainty. It was a decision that would echo across the next 4 centuries. Soon after, John Alden married Priscilla Mullins, a young woman who had endured unimaginable heartbreak. During Plymouth's first winter, her father, mother, and brother all died from disease and starvation, leaving her completely alone in a harsh and unfamiliar land. Yet from that tragedy came one of the colony's greatest success stories. John and Priscilla raised 11 children, and historians believe they produced more documented descendants than almost any other Mayflower couple. Today, their family tree includes former Vice President Dan Quayle, filmmaker Orson Welles, and actor Dick Van Dyke. A man hired to repair barrels became one of the most influential ancestors in American history simply because he decided to stay. Priscilla's survival also carried another remarkable legacy because of her father, William Mullins. Unlike many of the passengers, William Mullins arrived in America with a business plan. He wasn't thinking only about surviving the first winter. He believed a permanent community would eventually grow, and he intended to help supply it. When historians examined the inventory of his belongings after his death, they found something astonishing. Mullins had packed 126 pairs of shoes and 13 pairs of boots aboard the Mayflower. That was more footwear than there were passengers on the ship. It sounds excessive until you realize what he saw. Mullins wasn't preparing for a voyage. He was preparing for a town. Along with the shoes came leather clothing, hats, stockings, tools, and other valuable supplies that would have been almost impossible to replace in the New World. He understood that every successful settlement needed craftsmen, merchants, and trade, not just farmers. Sadly, he never lived to see that vision become reality. Like so many others, William Mullins died during the colony's first winter. His wife and son also perished, leaving Priscilla as the only surviving member of the immediate family. Through her marriage to John Alden, William Mullins' legacy continued, proving that sometimes a family's future depends on the survival of just one person. While Mullins dreamed of building the colony's economy, another passenger was focused on something far more urgent: keeping everyone alive. Miles Standish wasn't a pilgrim either. He was a professional soldier with years of military experience in Europe. The investors behind the Mayflower expedition believed the settlers would need someone capable of defending them in an unfamiliar land, so they hired Standish to accompany the voyage. He quickly became Plymouth Colony's military leader. When danger threatened, Standish organized defenses, trained the settlers, and led expeditions beyond the colony's borders. His experience provided stability at a time when even a single mistake could have destroyed the settlement. Yet his personal life was marked by the same heartbreak experienced by so many others. During that devastating first winter, his wife Rose died, leaving him alone in a land thousands of miles from home. Even after such a loss, Standish chose to remain. He spent the rest of his life protecting the colony, earning a reputation as one of Plymouth's most important figures. His descendants include Deborah Sampson, the remarkable woman who disguised herself as a man to fight during the American Revolutionary War, proving that courage continued to run through the Standish family long after Miles himself was gone. But if Standish was the colony's protector, the next passenger possessed something no one else on the Mayflower could claim: experience. Stephen Hopkins had already been to America. More than 10 years before the Mayflower sailed, Hopkins had survived one of the most famous shipwrecks in history. He was aboard the Sea Venture when a violent hurricane drove the vessel onto the reefs surrounding Bermuda. Stranded for months, Hopkins eventually reached Jamestown before returning to England. Most people would never have crossed the Atlantic again after such an ordeal. Hopkins did exactly that. He voluntarily boarded the Mayflower, becoming the only passenger with first-hand knowledge of the New World. While everyone else wondered what awaited them across the ocean, Hopkins already knew how difficult colonial life could be. His earlier shipwreck became famous for another reason as well. Many historians believe it inspired William Shakespeare's play The Tempest, making Stephen Hopkins one of the few people whose life may have influenced one of the greatest works in English literature. When the settlers needed practical advice about surviving in America, Hopkins wasn't speaking from hope. He was speaking from experience. As valuable as his knowledge proved to be, the colony's greatest internal threat wasn't starvation or harsh weather. Came from one of their own passengers. The next surname belongs to the most notorious family on the Mayflower. They nearly caused a disaster before the colony even began, and years later, one member would become the first convicted murderer in Plymouth's history. Not every passenger aboard the Mayflower became famous for courage or leadership. Some became famous for all the wrong reasons. If there was one family that constantly tested the patience of Plymouth colony, it was the Billingtons. From the moment they arrived, John Billington earned a reputation for challenging authority. While the Pilgrims relied on discipline and cooperation to survive, Billington often did the opposite. He argued with leaders, ignored rules, and created conflict in a settlement where unity could mean the difference between life and death. But if John Billington was difficult, his son Francis nearly changed history forever. While the Mayflower was still anchored in Cape Cod Harbor, Francis began playing with one of the ship's muskets near open barrels of gunpowder. One accidental shot could have ignited an explosion powerful enough to destroy the ship and kill everyone on board before Plymouth colony had even begun. Fortunately, disaster was avoided. Yet, history wasn't finished with the Billington family. One day, young Francis climbed a nearby hill to get a better view of the unfamiliar landscape. Looking into the distance, he spotted what appeared to be a large body of water. Curious, the settlers investigated and discovered a massive freshwater lake that would later become known as Billington Sea. It became one of the colony's most valuable natural resources, supplying fresh water during its earliest years. The same family that nearly caused catastrophe had also helped the settlement survive. Several years later, after a dispute over hunting land, Billington shot another colonist named John Newcomen. He was arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and executed, becoming the first person in Plymouth colony to be convicted and put to death for murder. But John Billington's story would end far more dramatically. It's one of history's greatest ironies. One of the original passengers who crossed the Atlantic seeking a better future became the colony's first convicted murderer. Yet even that wasn't the end of the family's legacy. Among Billington's descendants was James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, proving once again that history rarely follows a straight line. The next surname, however, tells a story filled not with scandal, but with hope. William and Susanna White boarded the Mayflower with their young son Resolved. During the long voyage across the Atlantic, Susanna became pregnant, and while the ship sat anchored in Cape Cod Harbor, waiting for the settlers to decide their future, she gave birth to another son. His name was Peregrine White. He became the first English child born to the Mayflower passengers in the New World. Imagine beginning your life aboard a crowded wooden ship surrounded by uncertainty, storms, and exhausted settlers who had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But happiness was short-lived. Like so many others, William White died during the colony's first winter, leaving Susanna alone with 2 young children. Survival became more uncertain than ever. Then something remarkable happened. Edward Winslow, another passenger who had also lost his wife during that terrible winter, found comfort in Susanna. Together, they rebuilt their lives, and their marriage became the first recorded wedding ceremony in Plymouth Colony. It's a reminder that even during humanity's darkest moments, hope has a way of finding people again. Peregrine White grew into adulthood, lived to the age of 83, and witnessed Plymouth transform from a fragile settlement into an established colony. His life became a symbol of resilience, proving that the future could still flourish despite unimaginable loss. That future owed much to the man who became his stepfather. Edward Winslow was one of Plymouth Colony's greatest diplomats. While Miles Standish defended the settlement with military strength, Winslow protected it through trust, patience, and negotiation. His most important relationship was with Massasoit, the respected leader of the Wampanoag people. At a time when fear and misunderstanding could easily have led to war, Winslow worked tirelessly to build peace between 2 very different cultures. One story stands above all the others. When Massasoit became seriously ill, many believed he would soon die. Winslow personally cared for him, nursing him back to health. That act of compassion strengthened an alliance that helped Plymouth Colony survive during its most vulnerable years. Without that relationship, historians believe the colony's future might have been very different. Winslow also gave the world another priceless gift. When people think about the first Thanksgiving, much of what they imagine comes from paintings or tradition. But one of the only first-hand descriptions of that famous 1621 harvest celebration comes from Edward Winslow himself. His written account remains one of the most valuable historical records from Plymouth Colony. Without Edward Winslow's words, one of America's best-known traditions might have been remembered very differently. If you're enjoying these stories, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover the incredible history hidden inside ordinary family names. And if you've recognized one of these surnames in your own family tree so far, let us know in the comments. You might be surprised by who else shares your ancestry. Coming up next are 4 remarkable passengers whose stories are just as unforgettable. One crossed the Atlantic completely alone, hoping to reunite with his family years later. Another became the spiritual heart of Plymouth Colony. One dedicated his life to saving others before losing his own to disease. And another quietly built a legacy that eventually reached one of America's most celebrated artists. Their stories are every bit as extraordinary. While many families crossed the Atlantic together, Richard Warren made one of the hardest decisions imaginable. He left his entire family behind. His wife Elizabeth and their 5 daughters remained in England while Warren boarded the Mayflower alone. It wasn't because he wanted to abandon them. He was taking a risk that many settlers believed was necessary. Someone had to go first, find out if the New World offered any real hope, and build a home before bringing the rest of the family across. Imagine watching England disappear over the horizon, not knowing whether you would ever see your wife or children again. Richard survived the Atlantic crossing. He survived the colony's first winter. He survived the disease and starvation that claimed nearly half the settlement. Then, he waited not for weeks, not for months, but for 3 long years. Finally, in 1623, his wife and daughters arrived aboard another ship called the Ancestry. Against incredible odds, the family was reunited. Together, they welcomed 2 more sons, creating one of the largest Mayflower family lines. Although Richard died only a few years later, his descendants continued his legacy. Among them was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, proving that one father's sacrifice would eventually shape the course of American history. If Richard Warren represented hope for the future, William Brewster represented something equally important: faith. Long before the Mayflower sailed, Brewster had served in the English government and studied at Cambridge University. He understood power and politics, but he chose a different path. Believing that true worship required independence from the Church of England, he became one of the leading figures of the separatist movement. His beliefs forced him into exile in the Netherlands, where he spent years helping build the religious community that would eventually sail to America. By the time the Mayflower departed, Brewster was one of the oldest passengers on board during the colony's darkest days. When sickness spread through every household and death seemed impossible to escape, Brewster became the community's spiritual leader. While others built homes or defended the settlement, he strengthened something just as important: their determination to continue. He reminded grieving families why they had crossed the Atlantic in the first place. His calm leadership helped hold the community together when it could easily have fallen apart. But faith alone could not defeat disease. For that, the settlers relied on Samuel Fuller. Medicine in the 17th century was nothing like it is today. There were no antibiotics, no modern hospitals, and no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Even common illnesses could become deadly within days. Despite these limitations, Samuel Fuller became Plymouth Colony's closest thing to a physician. Whenever someone became ill, Fuller answered the call. He cared for sick children, treated injuries, and traveled between settlements sharing what medical knowledge he possessed. In many ways, he became one of the colony's quiet heroes, working tirelessly while others struggled simply to survive. Then, in 1633, tragedy struck once more. A devastating smallpox epidemic swept through New England. The man who had spent years trying to save lives became one of its victims. Samuel Fuller died serving the very people he had dedicated his life to helping. His descendants would eventually include actor Richard Gere, linking one of Hollywood's best-known names to Plymouth's first physician. The final surname in this chapter belongs to a man whose story proves that greatness isn't always recognized during a person's lifetime. Francis Cooke rarely appears in school textbooks, yet his journey was every bit as remarkable as the others. Originally from Norwich, England, Cooke had settled in the Dutch city of Leiden before deciding to join the Mayflower expedition. Like Richard Warren, he crossed the Atlantic without most of his family, leaving his wife Hester and several children behind until conditions in America became safer. He survived the colony's brutal first winter and patiently waited until his family could join him aboard the Ancestry. In 1623, together they built a successful life in Plymouth, and Cooke eventually became one of the oldest surviving Mayflower passengers. His descendants reached far beyond Colonial America. Among them was Grandma Moses, one of the most celebrated folk artists in American history. Remarkably, she didn't begin painting seriously until she was nearly 80 years old, proving that it's never too late to leave your mark on the world. From a quiet wool worker, aboard the Mayflower came an artist whose paintings would one day hang in museums across the globe. It's extraordinary how often history rewards perseverance rather than fame, but our journey isn't over yet. The final chapter contains perhaps the most emotional stories of all. We'll meet the businessman whose ambition nearly destroyed his reputation, the little girl who became the last surviving passenger of the Mayflower, and the orphan whose survival connected millions of descendants to one of the greatest rescue stories in American history. And when all 15 names finally come together, you'll understand why the legacy of the Mayflower isn't really about a ship at all. It's about family. The final 2 names on our list remind us that history isn't simply about victories or defeats. It's about people. Real people whose choices, mistakes, sacrifices, and resilience continue to shape millions of lives today. Isaac Allerton arrived in Plymouth as one of the colony's most respected leaders. Intelligent, ambitious, and well-connected, he quickly became Governor William Bradford's trusted representative in England. Whenever the colony needed supplies, negotiated debts with investors, or handled important business matters overseas, Allerton was the man they relied upon. At first, he seemed indispensable. He crossed the Atlantic multiple times, negotiating trade agreements and securing supplies that helped keep the struggling settlement alive. Without those connections, Plymouth's future would have looked very uncertain, but success can sometimes create temptation. As the years passed, questions began to emerge about Allerton's financial dealings. Bradford and other leaders believed he was making business decisions that benefited himself more than the colony. Trust slowly disappeared, and eventually Allerton was removed from his position. It's a reminder that even among people who had survived unimaginable hardship together, ambition and personal interest could still create division. Yet Isaac Allerton's greatest legacy wasn't found in business records or political disputes. It was found in his daughter. Mary Allerton was only a small child when she crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower. She survived the terrifying voyage, survived the deadly first winter, and then did something no one else on that ship managed to do. She simply kept living. One by one, every other original passenger passed away. Governors died, soldiers died, doctors died, religious leaders died. Even the children who had survived into adulthood eventually passed on. But Mary remained. When she died in 1699, she became the final surviving passenger of the Mayflower, the last living person who could say, "I was there." Imagine the memories she carried. She had seen Plymouth when it was nothing more than a few fragile shelters carved into the wilderness. She had watched frightened settlers become parents, grandparents, and founders of entirely new communities. She witnessed history transform from lived experience into legend. With her passing, the last direct human connection to that remarkable voyage finally came to an end. And then we arrive at the final surname, perhaps the most emotional story of them all. John and Joan Tilley boarded the Mayflower with their young daughter Elizabeth, hoping to build a brighter future. Neither parent lived long enough to see it. During the colony's first winter, both died, leaving Elizabeth completely alone. She wasn't the only orphan in Plymouth, but she was among the youngest. Think about that for a moment. A teenage girl, thousands of miles from home, her parents gone, her relatives gone, surrounded by sickness, hunger, and uncertainty. Most people would have expected her story to end there. Instead, it was only beginning. As Elizabeth grew older, she married John Howland, the young man whose life had been saved by a single rope in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. One survivor rescued from the sea. Another survivor rescued from overwhelming loss. Together, they built one of the largest families in early American history, raising 10 children whose descendants now number in the millions. Among them are philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, actor Humphrey Bogart, Christopher Lloyd, members of the Baldwin family, and countless others whose stories continue to unfold today. It's remarkable to think that one young orphan and one young man who almost drowned would help shape generations of American history. And when you step back and look at the Mayflower as a whole, something extraordinary becomes clear. This was never just the story of a ship. It was the story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. An Alden, orphan who became a governor, a barrel maker who never planned to stay, a young man who refused to let go of a rope, a businessman who dreamed of building a community, a soldier who protected people who didn't even share his beliefs, a survivor of one shipwreck who willingly crossed the Atlantic again, a family remembered for both discovery and tragedy, a baby born before the colony even existed, a diplomat who helped preserve peace, a father separated from his family for years, a spiritual leader who gave people hope, a doctor who sacrificed his own life caring for others, a quiet craftsman whose descendants inspired millions through art, a little girl who outlived everyone else, and an orphan who proved that even the deepest loss doesn't have to define the rest of your life. Together, these 15 surnames became the roots of an enormous family tree. Its branches stretched across generations, crossed state lines, and eventually reached every corner of the United States today. Millions of people carry that legacy without even realizing it, which brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Could your last name be one of them? Maybe it already is. Maybe it's hidden somewhere deeper in your family tree. Or maybe your family's story is still waiting to be discovered. That's the beauty of genealogy. Every document, every census, every birth record, every faded photograph has the potential to reveal a story that has been waiting centuries to be told. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most remarkable family trees, don't forget to subscribe to *** Unknown Discoveries *** and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into history, ancestry, genealogy, and the forgotten stories that shaped our world. If one of these surnames appears in your own family history, tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if none of them do, let us know which story surprised you the most, because every family has a history, every name has a story. And sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found in museums or ancient ruins. They're waiting inside your own family tree. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep discovering the unknown.